In the grand ballrooms of 1820s London, where fortunes were made through marriage and reputations destroyed with a whisper, one duke would discover that the greatest deceptions often reveal the most profound truths. What began as a test of character would unveil a conspiracy so shocking it would forever change the fate of an innocent young woman whose parents saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be sold. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning mist clung to the windows of Pemberton Manor like a shroud, casting ethereal shadows across the opulent drawing-room where Lady Evangeline Pemberton sat in practiced stillness. Her delicate fingers traced the intricate embroidery of her silk morning dress, a creation that had cost more than most families earned in a year, yet felt as confining as prison garb upon her slender frame. At 19, Evangeline possessed the kind of beauty that poets wrote sonnets about. Auburn hair that caught fire in candlelight, emerald eyes that sparkled with intelligence her parents deemed unnecessary, and a spirit that yearned for something beyond the gilded cage of her aristocratic existence. Yet for all her physical perfection, she remained invisible in the grand scheme of her family's ambitions. "Evangeline, darling, do sit straighter," her mother, Lady Margaret Pemberton, commanded from across the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been denied anything in her 45 years of privileged existence. "Lord Blackwood will be calling this afternoon, and we cannot afford any imperfections." The mention of Lord Blackwood sent a familiar chill down Evangeline's spine. Damien Blackwood, heir to one of England's most powerful dukedoms, was everything society deemed desirable. Wealthy, titled, and devastatingly handsome. Yet beneath his polished exterior lurked something that made Evangeline's skin crawl, though she could never quite articulate what it was. "Mother, surely there's no need for such formality," Evangeline ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've known Lord Blackwood since childhood." Lady Margaret's laugh was as sharp as winter wind. "Known him? My dear child, you've been promised to him since you were in swaddling clothes. This afternoon's visit is merely a formality before the official announcement at the Duchess of Marlborough's ball next week." The words hit Evangeline like physical blows. Promised, sold, bartered like cattle at market. She had always known this day would come, had been raised with the understanding that her purpose was to secure advantageous alliances for the Pemberton name. Yet hearing it spoken so coldly, so matter-of-factly, made her stomach churn with rebellion. "But, Mother, what if nothing?" Lord Edmund Pemberton interrupted, as he strode into the room, his presence commanding immediate silence. Evangeline's father was a man who had built his fortune through calculated marriages and strategic alliances, viewing his daughter as his greatest asset. The arrangements have been finalized, the contracts signed. "You will marry Blackwood, and you will do so with grace and gratitude." Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "Father, please, I barely know him. Surely in this modern age, a woman might have some say in her own future." Lord Edmund's face darkened with displeasure. "Modern age? You speak of modern nonsense, girl. Love is a luxury we cannot afford. The Pemberton estates are heavily mortgaged, and Blackwood's dowry offer will secure our family's position for generations. Your feelings are irrelevant." The brutal honesty of his words struck Evangeline speechless. She had always suspected their lavish lifestyle was built on shaky foundations, but to hear her father speak so openly of their financial desperation was devastating. She was not a daughter to be cherished, but a commodity to be traded. As if summoned by their conversation, the butler appeared in the doorway. "My lord, Lord Blackwood has arrived." Evangeline's blood turned to ice as footsteps echoed in the marble hallway. Heavy, confident steps that spoke of a man who had never been denied anything he desired. She smoothed her skirts with trembling hands, forcing her expression into the serene mask she had perfected over years of social training. Damian Blackwood entered the room like a conquering hero, claiming his prize. Tall and imposing, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, he possessed the kind of classical handsomeness that made debutantes swoon across London's ballrooms. Yet Evangeline saw something else in his gaze, a coldness that spoke of cruelty, carefully concealed beneath polished manners. "Lord and Lady Pemberton," he said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, "and my beautiful Evangeline." The possessive way he spoke her name made her skin crawl. "Lord Blackwood," she replied, rising to curtsy with practiced grace. "How lovely to see you again." His smile was predatory as he approached, taking her hand and pressing it to his lips in a gesture that lingered far too long for propriety. "The pleasure is entirely mine, my dear. I trust you're prepared for our announcement next week." "She's absolutely thrilled," Lady Margaret answered before Evangeline could speak. "Aren't you, darling?" Evangeline felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes upon her, each expecting complete compliance. "Of course," she managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging within her heart. "Excellent," Blackwood said, his grip on her hand tightening almost imperceptibly. "I do so appreciate obedience in a wife." The word obedience hung in the air like a threat, and Evangeline felt her future crystallizing before her, a life of submission to a man who saw her as property, surrounded by luxury but devoid of love or respect. The golden cage was closing around her, and she could almost hear the lock clicking into place. As the afternoon wore on, filled with discussions of wedding arrangements and financial settlements, Evangeline found herself wondering if this was truly all life held for her. Was she destined to become another ornament in Blackwood's collection, beautiful but voiceless, cherished but never truly loved? But what she didn't know was that fate was already weaving a different tapestry for her future, one that would begin with a chance encounter that would change everything she thought she knew about love, honor, and the true measure of a man's worth. The Duchess of Marlborough's annual spring ball was the pinnacle of London's social season, a glittering spectacle where fortunes were made, reputations destroyed, and the future of England's aristocracy was decided over champagne and whispered conversations. The Duke of Marlborough's palatial estate blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors, creating an atmosphere of almost otherworldly magnificence. Evangeline stood before her bedroom mirror as her lady's maid Sarah made final adjustments to her gown, a creation of ivory silk and French lace that had cost her father a small fortune. The dress was undeniably beautiful, with its sweeping train and delicate pearl embellishments, yet it felt like armor she was donning for battle rather than celebration. "You look absolutely radiant, my lady," Sarah whispered, her weathered hands gentle as she arranged Evangeline's auburn curls into an elaborate coiffure adorned with her grandmother's diamond tiara, like a princess from a fairy tale. If only fairy tales were real, Evangeline thought bitterly. In stories, the princess always found true love and lived happily ever after. In reality, she was about to be publicly claimed by a man who made her skin crawl, her engagement announced to all of London society like the sale of prized livestock. "Sarah," Evangeline said quietly, "do you think it's possible for a person to change their fate?" The older woman's eyes met hers in the mirror, filled with a sadness that spoke of her own lost dreams. "I think, my lady, that sometimes fate has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. But we must be brave enough to recognize the opportunity when it comes." Before Evangeline could respond, her mother's voice echoed through the hallway. "Evangeline, Lord Blackwood has arrived." The carriage ride to Marlborough House passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Blackwood sat across from her, resplendent in his evening attire, his eyes never leaving her face with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable. Her parents flanked her like guards, ensuring a prisoner's compliance, their excitement palpable as they discussed the advantageous connections this union would bring. "You understand, my dear," Blackwood said, his voice low and intimate, "that after tonight you belong to me completely. I expect absolute loyalty and obedience from my wife." The possessive way he spoke made Evangeline's stomach turn, but she merely nodded, knowing that any protest would be futile. She was trapped, and they all knew it. Marlborough House was ablaze with activity when they arrived. The cream of London society had gathered in their finest attire, duchesses dripping with jewels, earls in perfectly tailored evening wear, and debutantes hoping to catch the eye of eligible bachelors. The air was thick with perfume, ambition, and barely concealed scandal. As they entered the grand ballroom, Evangeline felt hundreds of eyes upon her. Word of her impending engagement had already spread through society's gossip network, and she could see the mixture of envy, pity, and calculation in the faces around her. Some women looked at her with jealousy. After all, she was about to become one of the most powerful duchesses in England. Others, particularly those who knew Blackwood's true nature, regarded her with sympathy. "Lady Evangeline," the Duchess of Marlborough greeted her warmly, though her eyes held a hint of concern. "How lovely you look this evening. I do hope you'll save a dance for my nephew, the Duke of Ashford. He's just returned from his travels abroad." Blackwood's hand tightened possessively on Evangeline's arm. "I'm afraid Lady Evangeline's dance card is quite full this evening, Your Grace. After all, a woman should dance primarily with her intended." The Duchess's smile faltered slightly at his presumptuous tone, but she merely nodded graciously. "Of course, Lord Blackwood. How thoughtless of me." As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself moving through the motions like an automaton. She danced when commanded, smiled when expected, and accepted congratulations on her engagement with practiced grace. Yet beneath her composed exterior, a growing sense of desperation clawed at her chest. It was during the third waltz that she noticed him, a man standing near the French doors leading to the garden, watching the proceedings with an expression of barely concealed disgust. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see through the glittering facade to the ugly realities beneath. His evening attire, while perfectly proper, lacked the ostentatious display of wealth that characterized most of the men present. There was something about him that drew her attention. Perhaps it was the way he stood apart from the crowd, or the genuine warmth in his smile when he spoke to the servants, treating them with a respect that was rare among the aristocracy. When their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, she felt a jolt of recognition, though she was certain they had never been introduced. "Who is that gentleman?" she asked Lady Pemberton during a brief respite between dances. Her mother followed her gaze and frowned. "I believe that's Mr. Alexander Hartwell, some sort of scholar or philosopher. Hardly worth your attention, darling. He has no title and modest means at best." The dismissive way her mother spoke of him only increased Evangeline's curiosity. In a world where worth was measured solely by wealth and position, a man who commanded respect through character alone was a rare creature indeed. As the evening reached its crescendo, the Duke of Marlborough called for attention. The moment Evangeline had been dreading had arrived. Blackwood led her to the center of the ballroom, his grip on her hand almost painful in its intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "it is my great pleasure to announce the engagement of Lord Damien Blackwood to Lady Evangeline Pemberton. May their union bring joy and prosperity to both their noble houses." The applause was thunderous, but to Evangeline it sounded like the tolling of funeral bells. She forced a smile as Blackwood raised her hand to his lips, the gesture possessive and triumphant. This was it. Her fate was sealed before all of London society, but then, as if the universe itself had decided to intervene, disaster struck. Lady Charlotte Pemberton, Evangeline's younger sister, appeared at Blackwood's side, her face flushed with champagne and malicious glee. At 17, Charlotte possessed a beauty that was more obvious than Evangeline's subtle elegance, and a nature that was far more calculating. "Damien, darling," Charlotte purred, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed ballroom. "Surely you don't intend to go through with this charade?" Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the room turned toward them. Blackwood's expression shifted from triumph to something far more sinister. "Charlotte, what are you doing?" Evangeline whispered, but her sister's attention was focused entirely on Blackwood. "Tell them the truth, Damien," Charlotte continued, her voice growing louder and more reckless with each word. "Tell them about our midnight meetings in the garden. Tell them about the promises you made to me." The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs as the implications of Charlotte's words became clear. Evangeline stood frozen in the center of the storm, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Her own sister, her own flesh and blood, was publicly destroying her reputation and her future. Blackwood's mask finally slipped, revealing the cruel, calculating man beneath. "You're quite right, my dear Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Why should I settle for the elder sister when the younger is so much more accommodating?" The words hit Evangeline like physical blows. The humiliation was complete and devastating. Not only was she being publicly rejected, but she was being cast aside for her own sister, and in a way that suggested impropriety that would ruin her reputation forever. "I'm afraid," Blackwood continued with theatrical regret, "that I must withdraw my offer of marriage to Lady Evangeline. It seems my heart has been captured by another." The gasps and whispers that followed were deafening. Evangeline stood in the center of the ballroom, abandoned and humiliated before the entire ton. Her parents' faces were masks of horror and rage, not for her pain, but for the social and financial disaster this represented. "You cannot be serious," Lord Pemberton sputtered, his face purple with apoplectic fury. "The contracts are signed, the arrangements made." Blackwood shrugged with casual indifference. "Contracts can be broken, my lord. Surely you wouldn't want to force an unwilling man to the altar." Through the haze of her humiliation, Evangeline became aware of movement at the edge of her vision. The mysterious Mr. Hartwell had stepped forward, his face dark with anger at the cruelty he was witnessing. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something there that she had never seen before, genuine concern for her welfare, untainted by calculation or self-interest. But even his sympathy couldn't save her from this moment. The damage was done. Her reputation was in ruins, her future destroyed, and her family's financial salvation had evaporated in a single devastating moment. As the crowd began to whisper and point, as her mother wept tears of rage and her father's face promised terrible retribution, Evangeline realized that her golden cage had not merely opened, it had been shattered completely, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in a world that showed no mercy to fallen women. Yet as she stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully planned life, a strange thought occurred to her. For the first time in her 19 years, she was truly free. The question was, would she have the courage to seize that freedom, or would she allow this moment of devastation to define the rest of her life? The answer to that question would determine not just her future, but the very essence of who she was meant to become. The carriage ride back to Pemberton Manor was a journey through hell itself. The silence was more deafening than any screaming match could have been, broken only by Lady Margaret's occasional sobs of rage and Lord Edmund's muttered curses about ruined reputations and financial disaster. Evangeline sat pressed against the velvet cushions, her beautiful gown now feeling like a mockery, her diamond tiara a crown of thorns upon her aching head. Charlotte, who had returned separately with the Blackwoods, had left behind a wake of destruction that would take years to repair, if it could be repaired at all. The scandal would be in every gossip column by morning, dissected and embellished until the truth became unrecognizable beneath layers of malicious speculation. 20 years, Lord Edmund finally spoke, his voice hollow with defeat. 20 years of careful planning, of building connections, of positioning this family for greatness. Destroyed in a single evening by your sister's treachery and your own inadequacy. The accusation hit Evangeline like a physical blow. My inadequacy. Father, I did nothing wrong. I was the victim of... You were supposed to secure him, Lady Margaret shrieked, her composure finally cracking completely. A woman's duty is to make herself indispensable to her husband. You clearly failed to inspire the devotion necessary to prevent this humiliation. Evangeline stared at her parents in growing horror. Even now, even after witnessing her public destruction, they blamed her for not being captivating enough to prevent her fiancé's betrayal with her own sister. The realization that they saw her as nothing more than a failed investment was more devastating than Blackwood's rejection. The next 3 days passed in a blur of shame and isolation. Evangeline remained in her chambers, unable to face the servants' pitying glances or her parents' continued recriminations. The scandal had indeed made every newspaper, each account more salacious than the last. Some portrayed her as a tragic victim, others as a woman so lacking in feminine charm that her own fiancé preferred her younger sister. It was on the 4th morning that salvation arrived in the most unexpected form. "Lady Evangeline," Sarah announced softly, "you have a visitor. Lady Agatha Worthington requests an audience." Evangeline looked up from her untouched breakfast, startled. Lady Agatha was her father's sister, a woman who had scandalized society 30 years earlier by refusing marriage and instead pursuing a life of independence in London. She was wealthy in her own right, having inherited a substantial fortune from their grandmother, and had used that wealth to support various charitable causes and intellectual pursuits. "Aunt Agatha is here?" Evangeline asked, hardly daring to believe it. She hadn't seen her aunt in over 2 years, their relationship having been discouraged by her parents, who considered Agatha's unconventional lifestyle a bad influence. "She's waiting in the morning room, my lady, and if I may say so, she seems quite determined to see you." Evangeline rose on unsteady legs, smoothing her simple morning dress with trembling hands. Whatever her aunt wanted, it had to be better than remaining trapped in this house of recriminations and shattered dreams. Lady Agatha Worthington was a woman who commanded attention without demanding it. At 52, she possessed a striking beauty that had only grown more distinguished with age. Her silver hair was arranged in an elegant chignon, her deep blue dress was fashionable yet practical, and her intelligent grey eyes missed nothing. She stood by the window, examining the garden with the same analytical gaze she applied to everything in life. "Aunt Agatha," Evangeline said softly, dropping into a curtsy. "Oh, my dear child," Agatha said, turning with arms outstretched. "Come here at once." The embrace was warm and genuine, the first comfort Evangeline had received since the disaster at Marlborough House. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into her aunt's strength, drawing solace from the unconditional acceptance she found there. "I came as soon as I heard," Agatha said, holding Evangeline at arm's length to study her face. "Though I must say, the newspaper accounts are so wildly contradictory that I suspect the truth is far more complex than any of them suggest." "The truth," Evangeline said bitterly, "is that I was a fool to believe that a man like Blackwood could ever truly want me for myself. I was merely a convenient arrangement until something more appealing presented itself." Agatha's eyes flashed with anger. "The truth, my dear, is that you've had a fortunate escape from a man who would have made your life a misery. I've known Damien Blackwood since he was a boy, and he's always been cruel and selfish. Better to discover his true nature now than after you were legally bound to him. But the scandal, Aunt Agatha, my reputation is ruined. No decent man will ever consider me now." "Decent men," Agatha said with a snort of derision, "are not so easily deterred by gossip and speculation. And frankly, my dear, any man who would judge you based on the malicious actions of others is not worthy of your consideration." Before Evangeline could respond, the door burst open and Lord Edmund strode in. his face dark with displeasure. "Agatha, I might have known you'd appear to fill my daughter's head with your radical nonsense." "Edmund," Agatha replied coolly, not bothering to rise from her chair, "how lovely to see you too. I trust you're well, despite your recent financial disappointments." The barb hit its mark. Lord Edmund's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "My financial affairs are none of your concern." "They are when they involve using my niece as collateral," Agatha replied sharply. "Yes, Edmund, I know about the debts, the mortgages, the desperate need for Blackwood's dowry payment. Did you really think such matters could be kept secret in London society?" Evangeline gasped, looking between her father and aunt. "What debts? What mortgages?" "Nothing that concerns you," Lord Edmund snapped, but Agatha continued relentlessly. "Your father has been living far beyond his means for years, my dear. The estate is mortgaged to the hilt, and several creditors are threatening legal action. Your marriage to Blackwood was meant to solve all his financial problems in one stroke." The revelation hit Evangeline like a physical blow. She had suspected their circumstances were not as secure as they appeared, but to learn that she had been literally sold to pay her father's debts was devastating. "That's enough, Agatha," Lord Edmund warned, his voice dangerous. "On the contrary, I think it's time Evangeline knew the truth about her situation," Agatha replied, rising to face her brother, "which is why I'm here to offer her an alternative." "What alternative?" Evangeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Agatha turned to her with a smile that was both gentle and determined. "Come to London with me, my dear. Live in my house, help me with my charitable work, and discover what kind of life you might build for yourself when you're free to make your own choices." "Absolutely not," Lord Edmund declared. "Evangeline will remain here until we can arrange another suitable marriage. There are still options, men who might overlook this scandal for the right incentives." "You mean men desperate enough for money to take damaged goods?" Agatha said bluntly. "How charming. And what happens when those incentives run out, Edmund? When the creditors come calling and you have nothing left to offer?" The silence that followed was telling. Lord Edmund's bluster deflated as the reality of his situation became clear. He was trapped by his own greed and poor decisions, and his daughter's future was the only currency he had left. "I won't let you corrupt her with your unconventional ideas," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "My ideas," Agatha replied, "include the radical notion that a woman might have value beyond her ability to secure advantageous marriages. That she might possess intelligence, creativity, and strength that could be used for purposes other than producing heirs and managing households." Evangeline felt something stirring within her chest, a spark of possibility that she had never dared to acknowledge. "What kind of charitable work?" she asked quietly. "I support several organizations that provide education and assistance to women in difficult circumstances," Agatha explained. "Widows who need to support themselves, young women who have been abandoned by their families, girls who want to learn trades or professions. It's meaningful work, and it would give you a chance to discover your own capabilities." "Evangeline," Lord Edmund warned, "if you leave this house with your aunt, you will be cut off completely. No inheritance, no family support, no possibility of return." The threat hung in the air like a sword, but for the first time in days, Evangeline felt a sense of clarity. She looked around the morning room, with its expensive furnishings and oppressive atmosphere, and realized that it had never truly been her home. It had been a beautiful prison, and she had been its most valuable prisoner. "I understand, Father," she said quietly, "but I think I need to discover who I am when I'm not being groomed for someone else's purposes." The decision, once made, brought an unexpected sense of peace. Within hours, her few personal belongings were packed, and she was seated beside her aunt in an elegant carriage bound for London. As Pemberton Manor disappeared behind them, Evangeline felt as though she was leaving behind not just a house, but an entire identity that had never truly belonged to her. "Are you frightened?" Agatha asked as they settled in for the journey. terrified, Evangeline admitted, but also excited. Is that strange? Not at all, my dear. Fear and excitement often go hand in hand when we're embarking on something truly worthwhile. London, when they arrived, was a revelation. Agatha's house in Bloomsbury was elegant but comfortable, filled with books, artwork, and the constant flow of interesting visitors. Writers, reformers, educators, and philanthropists gathered in her drawing room for spirited discussions about literature, politics, and social change. It was during one such gathering, 3 weeks after her arrival, that Evangeline first encountered Dr. Alexander Hartwell in a context that allowed for proper introduction. "Lady Evangeline," Agatha said, approaching with a tall, dark-haired gentleman at her side, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Alexander Hartwell. He's been instrumental in establishing several schools for working-class children in the East End." Evangeline's breath caught as she recognized the man who had watched her humiliation at Marlborough House with such evident sympathy. Up close, he was even more striking. Not conventionally handsome like Blackwood, but possessed of an intelligence and warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Lady Evangeline," he said, bowing slightly, "I believe we may have seen each other at the Duchess of Marlborough's ball, though we weren't properly introduced." "Yes," she replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I remember. I hope you'll forgive my saying so, but I was deeply impressed by your composure that evening. Lesser individuals might have been crushed by such circumstances." Though the kindness in his voice, the genuine respect in his manner, was so different from anything she had experienced in her previous life that she found herself momentarily speechless. "Dr. Hartwell has been telling me about his latest project," Agatha interjected smoothly. "A school for young women who wish to learn practical skills, bookkeeping, correspondence, even basic medical training. Perhaps you'd be interested in hearing about it." As doctor, Hartwell began to describe his work, his passion for education and social reform, evident in every word. Evangeline felt something awakening within her that she had never experienced before. This was a man who saw value in people regardless of their birth or circumstances, who believed in the power of knowledge to transform lives. "It sounds wonderful," she said when he finished. "But surely such work requires extensive training and experience. It requires compassion, intelligence, and a willingness to learn," he replied, his brown eyes meeting hers directly. "Qualities that I suspect you possess in abundance." The compliment, coming from a man who clearly valued substance over superficial charm, meant more to Evangeline than all the empty flattery she had received in ballrooms and drawing rooms. As the evening progressed, she found herself drawn into conversations about topics she had never been encouraged to consider: the plight of working women, the importance of education, the possibility of social reform. For the first time in her life, her opinions were sought and valued, her intelligence recognized and appreciated. When Dr. Hartwell took his leave, he paused beside her chair. "Lady Evangeline, I wonder if you might consider visiting one of our schools. I think you would find the work quite inspiring." "I would like that very much," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. After he left, Agatha settled beside her with a knowing smile. "An interesting man, don't you think?" "Very interesting," Evangeline admitted. "But Aunt Agatha, surely a man of his principles would never consider someone with my complicated history." "My dear child," Agatha said gently, "a man of true principle judges people by their character, not by the circumstances that have befallen them. And I suspect that Dr. Hartwell sees in you exactly what I see, a woman of remarkable strength and potential who has simply never been given the opportunity to flourish." As Evangeline prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few short weeks. The scandal that had seemed like the end of everything had instead become the beginning of a journey toward discovering her true self. But what she didn't yet know was that her past was not finished with her, and that the choices she made in the coming weeks would determine not just her own future, but the fate of others who depended on her newfound strength and courage. 6 weeks had passed since Evangeline's arrival in London, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The pale, frightened girl who had fled Pemberton Manor in disgrace had blossomed into a confident young woman with purpose and direction. Her days were filled with meaningful work at Dr. Hartwell's schools, where she taught basic literacy to working-class women and helped manage the administrative duties that kept the institutions running. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking. Many of the women came to them desperate, abandoned by families, or left destitute by circumstances beyond their control. Yet Evangeline found a deep satisfaction in helping them acquire the skills they needed to support themselves with dignity. More importantly, she had discovered capabilities within herself that she never knew existed. "Miss Thompson," she said gently to a young woman struggling with her letters, "remember what we discussed about the shape of the B and D. Take your time. There's no shame in learning slowly, only in not learning at all." Mary Thompson, a seamstress who had been dismissed from her position for refusing her employer's unwanted advances, looked up with grateful tears in her eyes. "Thank you, my lady. I never thought someone like me could learn to read proper." "Someone like you," Evangeline replied firmly, "deserves every opportunity to better herself. Your circumstances don't define your worth or your potential." From across the classroom, Dr. Hartwell watched this exchange with growing admiration. In the weeks since Evangeline had begun working at the school, he had witnessed her natural compassion and intelligence flourish in ways that took his breath away. She possessed an innate ability to connect with people from all walks of life, treating each student with the same respect and dignity, regardless of their background. "Lady Evangeline," he said as the lesson concluded and the students began to file out, "might I have a word?" She approached him with the easy confidence she had developed over the past weeks, no longer the timid girl who had been crushed by public humiliation. "Of course, Dr. Hartwell. Is there something wrong with my teaching methods?" "Quite the contrary," he replied, his brown eyes warm with approval. "I've been thinking about expanding our programs, and I believe you would be the perfect person to lead a new initiative." "Me?" Evangeline asked, surprised. "But I'm hardly qualified to lead anything. I've only been here a few weeks." "You underestimate yourself," he said gently. "I've watched you work with these women, seen how you inspire them to believe in their own potential. That's not something that can be taught. It's a gift." The sincerity in his voice made her heart flutter in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. Over the weeks, their professional relationship had deepened into something more personal, though neither had spoken of it directly. There were moments when their hands brushed as they reached for the same book, when their eyes met across a crowded classroom, when he smiled at something she said. That suggested feelings far deeper than mere collegiality. "What kind of initiative?" she asked, trying to focus on his words rather than the way his presence made her pulse quicken. "A program for women who have been cast out by society," he said carefully. "Women who have faced scandal or disgrace and need a place to rebuild their lives. You, more than anyone, understand what that experience entails." The suggestion was both flattering and painful. While Evangeline had found purpose and happiness in her new life, the memory of her public humiliation still stung. Yet perhaps that pain could be transformed into something useful, a way to help others who had faced similar circumstances. "I think," she said slowly, "that would be very meaningful work indeed." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Agatha, who swept into the classroom with her usual energy and purpose. "Evangeline, my dear, we need to discuss something rather urgent." Dr. Hartwell excused himself with a promise to continue their conversation later, leaving the two women alone. Agatha's expression was serious, which immediately put Evangeline on alert. "What's wrong, Aunt Agatha?" "I've received some rather disturbing news from our mutual acquaintances in society," Agatha said, settling into one of the small chairs with obvious discomfort. It seems that your sister Charlotte's engagement to Lord Blackwood has not proceeded as smoothly as expected. Evangeline felt a familiar knot form in her stomach at the mention of her sister and former fiancé. What do you mean? Apparently, Blackwood's true nature has begun to show itself. There have been incidents. Charlotte has been seen with bruises that she claims are from riding accidents, but the frequency and location of these injuries suggest otherwise. The blood drained from Evangeline's face. Despite everything Charlotte had done to her, she was still her sister, and the thought of her suffering physical abuse was horrifying. But surely her parents, our parents, would intervene if they suspected abuse. Agatha's expression was grim. Your parents are so desperate for the financial salvation this marriage represents that I fear they would overlook almost anything. The wedding is still planned for next month, and they're determined to see it through regardless of the cost to Charlotte's well-being. Evangeline sank into a chair, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated. Charlotte had destroyed her life for this marriage, and now she was discovering its true cost. But the larger part of her, the part that had been nurtured by weeks of helping others, felt only compassion for her sister's plight. "What can be done?" she asked quietly. "That, my dear, is what we need to discuss. There's to be a grand ball next week. The Earl of Pembroke's annual charity gala. All of London society will be there, including your family and Blackwood. It would be an opportunity for you to make a public reappearance, to show society that you've not only survived your scandal, but thrived despite it." The suggestion made Evangeline's stomach lurch with anxiety. "Aunt Agatha, I couldn't possibly." "The humiliation, the whispers," Agatha interrupted firmly, "of people whose opinions matter far less than you once believed. You are not the same woman who was destroyed at Marlborough House, Evangeline. You've discovered your own strength, your own worth. It's time to show the world what you've become." Before Evangeline could respond, Dr. Hartwell reappeared in the doorway, his expression apologetic. "Forgive the interruption, but there's someone here to see Lady Evangeline, a young woman who claims to be her sister." Evangeline's heart stopped. "Charlotte? Here?" "She's waiting in my office," he said gently. "She appears to be quite distressed." "Bin." With trembling legs, Evangeline made her way to Dr. Hartwell's modest office, where she found Charlotte huddled in a chair, her face pale and drawn. At 17, she had always been the more obviously beautiful of the two sisters, but now she looked fragile and frightened, a shadow of her former confident self. "Charlotte," Evangeline said softly, closing the door behind her. Her sister looked up with eyes that were red from crying. "Evangeline, I didn't know where else to go." Despite everything that had passed between them, Evangeline felt her heart break at the sight of her sister's distress. She knelt beside Charlotte's chair, taking her cold hands in her own. "What's happened? Are you hurt?" Charlotte's composure crumbled completely. "I've made such a terrible mistake," she sobbed. "Damien, he's not the man I thought he was. He's cruel and controlling, and when I try to resist him, he—" She gestured vaguely at her throat, where Evangeline could now see the faint outline of finger-shaped bruises. Rage, unlike anything she had ever experienced, flooded through Evangeline. The thought of Blackwood laying violent hands on anyone, even Charlotte, filled her with a fury that surprised her with its intensity. "You have to break the engagement," she said firmly. "No marriage is worth enduring abuse." "I can't," Charlotte whispered. "Father says the contracts are signed, the arrangements made. He says I have no choice but to go through with it, that the family's survival depends on this marriage." "The family's survival," Evangeline said bitterly, "seems to require sacrificing its daughters one by one." Charlotte looked at her with something approaching shame. "I know what I did to you was unforgivable. I was jealous and selfish, and I destroyed your life for my own gain. But Evangeline, I'm so frightened. I don't know what to do." The apology, long overdue though it was, touched something deep within Evangeline's heart. She saw now that Charlotte, for all her beauty and apparent confidence, was just as much a victim of their parents' ambitions as she herself had been. "There's always a choice," Evangeline said gently. "It may not be easy, and it may require sacrificing things you thought you wanted, but there's always a choice." "What do you mean?" Evangeline thought of her own journey over the past weeks, of the strength she had discovered within herself, of the meaningful life she was building. "I mean that you don't have to be what other people expect you to be. You can choose to be who you want to be, even if it means disappointing those who claim to love you." Charlotte stared at her in amazement. "You've changed," she said wonderingly. "You're so strong now, so sure of yourself." "I've learned that my worth isn't determined by other people's opinions," Evangeline replied, "and neither is yours." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, the sound of heavy footsteps, and then the office door burst open to reveal Lord Edmund Pemberton, his face purple with rage. "There you are, you ungrateful wretch," he snarled at Charlotte. "How dare you run away on the eve of your wedding preparations?" Behind him stood Damien Blackwood, his handsome face twisted with cold fury. "Charlotte, darling," he said, his voice deceptively gentle, "you've caused us all such worry. Come along now. We have much to discuss." The threat in his tone was unmistakable, and Charlotte shrank back in her chair like a cornered animal. But Evangeline rose to her full height, placing herself protectively between her sister and the two men. "I think," she said with a calm that surprised even herself, "that Charlotte has said quite enough for one day. Perhaps you gentlemen should leave." Blackwood's eyes fixed on her with a mixture of surprise and contempt. Well, well, the disgraced Lady Evangeline, playing at being a reformer. How quaint. "More quaint than a man who beats women?" she replied coolly. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Blackwood's mask of civility slipped completely, revealing the cruel, violent man beneath. "You always were too clever for your own good," he said softly. "Perhaps it's time someone taught you the consequences of speaking out of turn." He took a step toward her, but before he could move further, Dr. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, flanked by two other men from the school. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority, "I believe you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave immediately, or I'll be forced to summon the authorities." The standoff lasted several tense moments before Lord Edmund grabbed Charlotte's arm roughly. "Come along, girl, we're leaving." But Charlotte, inspired perhaps by her sister's courage, pulled free from his grasp. "No," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I won't go back. I won't marry him." "You will do as you're told," Lord Edmund thundered, "or you'll find yourself cut off without a penny, just like your sister." "Then so be it," Charlotte replied, moving to stand beside Evangeline. "I'd rather be poor and free than rich and terrified." The fury on both men's faces was terrible to behold, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. With threats of legal action and social ruin, they finally departed, leaving the sisters alone with Dr. Hartwell and Agatha, who had arrived during the confrontation. "Well," Agatha said with satisfaction, "that was quite illuminating. I think it's more important than ever that you attend the Pembroke Ball, my dear. Society needs to see what kind of man Damien Blackwood really is." Evangeline looked at her sister, who was still trembling from the encounter but standing straighter than she had in months. "We'll attend together," she said firmly. "It's time the world knew the truth about Lord Blackwood and men like him." Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, his eyes warm with admiration and something deeper. "If I may be so bold," he said quietly, "I would be honored to escort you both to the ball. It's time society met the remarkable woman you've become, Lady Evangeline." As Evangeline looked around at the faces of those who truly cared for her, her aunt, her sister, and the man who had helped her discover her own worth, she felt a strength and determination unlike anything she had ever experienced. The frightened girl who had fled Pemberton Manor was gone forever, replaced by a woman who would not be silenced, intimidated, or diminished. The battle for her future and for justice was about to begin, and this time she would not be fighting alone. The week leading up to the Earl of Pembroke's charity gala passed in a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Word of Charlotte's dramatic escape from her engagement had spread through London society like wildfire, creating a scandal that rivaled even Evangeline's original humiliation. The gossip columns were filled with speculation about the Pemberton family's troubles, and society matrons whispered behind their fans about the mysterious circumstances surrounding the broken betrothal. Evangeline found herself at the center of a storm she had never anticipated. Her quiet work at the schools had attracted little attention from the fashionable world, but her sister's refuge-seeking had thrust her back into the spotlight in the most dramatic way possible. Some viewed her as a corrupting influence who had turned Charlotte against her family's wishes, while others saw her as a heroic figure who had saved her sister from an abusive marriage. "The important thing," Agatha said, as they reviewed the guest list for the Pembroke Ball, "is that you're no longer the victim of circumstances beyond your control. You're now an active participant in shaping your own destiny." Charlotte, who had taken up residence in Agatha's house and was slowly recovering her natural spirits, looked up from the book she was reading, a treatise on women's education that would have horrified their parents. "I still can't believe I had the courage to refuse father," she said wonderingly. "A month ago, I would never have imagined defying him so completely." "Courage," Dr. Hartwell observed from his seat by the window, "is often contagious. Your sister's example showed you what was possible." The relationship between Evangeline and Dr. Hartwell had deepened considerably over the past week. Their shared concern for Charlotte's welfare had brought them closer together, and Evangeline found herself treasuring the quiet moments they spent discussing their work, their hopes, and their dreams for the future. He treated her as an intellectual equal, valued her opinions, and never once made her feel that her worth was dependent on her appearance or social connections. "Dr. Hartwell," Charlotte said with the directness that had always characterized her personality, "are you going to marry my sister?" The blunt question made Evangeline blush furiously, while Dr. Hartwell nearly choked on his tea. "Charlotte!" Evangeline exclaimed, mortified. "It's a perfectly reasonable question," Charlotte replied with a grin that reminded Evangeline of the mischievous girl she had been before their parents' ambitions had corrupted her natural spirit. "Anyone with eyes can see that you're both desperately in love with each other." "Charlotte, that's quite enough," Agatha said, though her tone was more amused than reproving. "Such matters require delicate handling." Dr. Hartwell set down his teacup with careful precision, his brown eyes meeting Evangeline's with an intensity that made her heart race. "Actually," he said quietly, "I think Lady Charlotte raises an excellent point. Perhaps it's time we discussed our feelings openly." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Evangeline felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. "Alexander," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. What I think my sister is trying to say," Charlotte interjected helpfully, "is that she's never been courted by a man who actually values her mind and character rather than her dowry and connections. She's terrified that this might all be some sort of wonderful dream." Dr. Hartwell rose from his chair and crossed to where Evangeline sat, kneeling beside her chair in a gesture that was both intimate and respectful. "Evangeline," he said, taking her hands in his, "I fell in love with your compassion the night I watched you endure public humiliation with such dignity. I fell in love with your intelligence as I watched you teach women who had been dismissed by society as worthless. I fell in love with your courage as you stood up to men who tried to intimidate you. Your dowry, or lack thereof, is completely irrelevant to my feelings." Tears sprang to Evangeline's eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "But Alexander, my reputation, my family's scandals. Surely a man in your position needs a wife who can enhance his standing in society, not damage it." "My position," he replied firmly, is that of a man who believes in justice, education, and the inherent worth of every human being. A wife who shares those values is worth more to me than all the social connections in England." "Oh, for heaven's sake," Agatha said with exasperated affection. "Just kiss her, young man, before we all expire from the suspense." Dr. Hartwell's eyes crinkled with amusement, but his expression remained serious as he searched Evangeline's face. "May I?" he asked softly. Instead of answering, Evangeline leaned forward and kissed him herself, a gesture that was both bold and tender. The kiss was everything her first kiss with Blackwood had not been: gentle, respectful, and filled with genuine emotion rather than possessive dominance. When they broke apart, Charlotte applauded enthusiastically while Agatha dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Well," Agatha said briskly, "I suppose we'll need to add engagement announcements to our preparations for tomorrow evening." "Tomorrow evening," Dr. Hartwell said, his arm now around Evangeline's waist, "will be quite eventful indeed. Are you prepared for what we might face?" Evangeline thought of the challenges ahead, the whispers, the confrontations, the possibility that Blackwood and her father might attempt some sort of retaliation. But she also thought of the strength she had discovered within herself, the love and support of those around her, and the meaningful life she was building. "I'm ready," she said with quiet confidence. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The Earl of Pembroke's mansion blazed with light as carriages deposited London's elite at the grand entrance. The charity gala was one of the season's most prestigious events, and the guest list included everyone from members of Parliament to foreign dignitaries. The cause, education for underprivileged children, was one that Dr. Hartwell had championed for years, making their attendance both personally and professionally significant. Evangeline stood before her mirror as Sarah made final adjustments to her gown, a creation of deep sapphire silk that brought out the color of her eyes and complemented her auburn hair perfectly. The dress was elegant but not ostentatious, reflecting her new understanding that true beauty came from confidence and purpose rather than expensive adornment. "You look absolutely radiant, my lady," Sarah said with genuine warmth, "like a woman who knows her own worth." "I feel different," Evangeline admitted. "Stronger, more myself, if that makes sense." "Perfect sense, my lady. You found your true calling, and it shows." Charlotte appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a gown of soft rose silk that complemented her fair coloring. The past week had worked wonders for her appearance. The haunted look had left her eyes, replaced by a sparkle of mischief and determination that reminded Evangeline of their childhood together. "Are you nervous?" Charlotte asked, settling beside her sister. "Terrified," Evangeline admitted, "but also excited. Does that sound strange?" "Not at all. I feel the same way. For the first time in my life, I'm attending a social event as myself, rather than as someone else's idea of what I should be." Agatha joined them, magnificent in midnight blue velvet, with her grandmother's sapphires at her throat. "Ladies, our carriage awaits, and might I say, you both look absolutely formidable. Society won't know what hit them." The journey to Pembroke House was filled with nervous energy and last-minute preparations. Dr. Hartwell, elegant in his evening attire, sat across from Evangeline, his presence both calming and thrilling. They had agreed that their engagement would be announced privately to close friends before any public declaration, but Evangeline knew that their obvious affection for each other would not go unnoticed. "Remember," Agatha said as they approached the mansion, "you are not the same women who left society in disgrace. You are educated, purposeful, and surrounded by people who value you for who you truly are. Hold your heads high." The moment they entered the ballroom, Evangeline felt the familiar sensation of being watched and whispered about. But this time, instead of shrinking from the attention, she met it head-on. She smiled graciously at acquaintances, accepted congratulations on her charitable work, and introduced Dr. Hartwell with obvious pride. "Lady Evangeline," the Duchess of Marlborough approached with genuine warmth. How wonderful to see you looking so well. I've heard remarkable things about your work with Dr. Hartwell's schools. Thank you, Your Grace. The work has been incredibly fulfilling. I should very much like to hear more about it. Perhaps you might call on me next week. I'm always interested in supporting worthy causes. As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself surrounded by people who were genuinely interested in her work and opinions. The scandal that had once defined her seemed to fade into insignificance beside her current accomplishments. She was no longer simply the girl who had been publicly humiliated. She was a woman who had transformed that humiliation into purpose and strength. It was during the second waltz that the confrontation she had been dreading finally occurred. Lord Blackwood appeared at her elbow, his handsome face twisted with barely concealed rage. "Lady Evangeline," he said with false courtesy, "how unexpected to see you here. I trust you're enjoying your little rebellion against proper society." "I'm enjoying my life very much, thank you," she replied calmly, not missing a step in her dance with Dr. Hartwell. "And you, Doctor?" "Hartwell," Blackwood continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "I suppose you think yourself quite clever, stealing away my former fiancée and her sister?" "I think," Dr. Hartwell replied with quiet dignity, "that both ladies made their own choices based on their own best interests, something you seem to have difficulty understanding." Blackwood's mask of civility slipped completely. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Hartwell. The Pemberton family owes me a considerable debt, and I intend to collect it one way or another." "Is that a threat, my lord?" Dr. Hartwell asked, his voice carrying clearly to the couples dancing nearby. "It's a promise," Blackwood snarled, loud enough for several people to hear. The music stopped abruptly as the other dancers became aware of the confrontation. A circle began to form around them, society's appetite for scandal drawing them like moths to flame. "Lord Blackwood," Evangeline said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom, "I think it's time society knew the truth about your character." "You wouldn't dare," he hissed. "Wouldn't I?" She turned to address the growing crowd, her voice steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think you should know that Lord Blackwood's idea of courtship includes physical violence against women who displease him. My sister bears the bruises to prove it." Gasps echoed through the ballroom as the accusation hung in the air. Blackwood's face went white with rage, then red with humiliation as he realized the damage her words had done. "You lying witch!" he snarled, raising his hand as if to strike her, but Dr. Hartwell stepped smoothly between them, catching Blackwood's wrist in a grip that made the other man wince. "I wouldn't," he said quietly, "if I were you. Striking a lady in public would rather prove her point, don't you think?" The Earl of Pembroke himself appeared, flanked by several other gentlemen. "Lord Blackwood," he said with icy authority, "I think it would be best if you left my home immediately. Violence against women is not tolerated in civilized society." As Blackwood was escorted from the ballroom, his threats and curses echoing behind him, Evangeline felt a profound sense of liberation. She had faced her tormentor and emerged victorious, not through manipulation or social maneuvering, but through simple truth and courage. "Well done, my dear," Agatha murmured as the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement over the dramatic confrontation. "Indeed," Dr. Hartwell said, his arm protectively around her waist. "I've never been more proud of anyone in my life." As the evening continued, Evangeline found herself the center of a different kind of attention. Instead of whispers of scandal, she heard expressions of admiration for her courage. Instead of pity for her circumstances, she received congratulations on her engagement to Dr. Hartwell, which had been quietly announced to their circle of friends. "Lady Evangeline," the Earl of Pembroke approached as the evening was winding down, "I wanted to personally thank you for your courage tonight. Men like Blackwood rely on silence and intimidation to continue their abuse. By speaking out, you may have saved other women from similar treatment. Thank you, my lord. I only hope that Charlotte and I can help other women find the strength to escape such situations. Speaking of which," he continued. "I understand you and Dr. Hartwell are planning to expand your educational programs. I should very much like to discuss funding for such endeavors." As they made their way home in the early hours of the morning, Evangeline reflected on how completely her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a frightened girl trapped by others' expectations. Tonight, she was a woman who had chosen her own path and found the courage to defend it publicly. "No regrets?" Dr. Hartwell asked softly as their carriage rolled through the quiet London streets. "None whatsoever," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "For the first time in my life, I feel truly free. And what will you do with that freedom?" Charlotte asked with a smile. Evangeline looked at the faces of those she loved, her sister, her aunt, and the man who had helped her discover her own worth, and felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. "I'm going to use it to help other women find theirs," she said simply. "And I'm going to build a life based on love and respect, rather than duty and obligation." As their carriage turned into Agatha's street, Evangeline knew that while challenges lay ahead, she would face them with confidence and courage. She had learned that true strength came not from avoiding scandal or conforming to expectations, but from staying true to one's principles and fighting for what was right. The frightened girl who had once been sold like property was gone forever, replaced by a woman who would never again allow anyone to determine her worth or dictate her choices. And that transformation, born from humiliation and nurtured by love, would prove to be the greatest victory of all. 8 months had passed since that triumphant evening at the Earl of Pembroke's ball, and the crisp October air of 1821 carried with it the promise of new beginnings. Evangeline stood at the window of her new home in Bath, watching the morning mist rise from the River Avon as she sipped her tea. The Georgian townhouse was modest compared to the grand estates of her childhood, but it was theirs, hers and Alexander's, and every corner reflected their shared values and dreams. The wedding had taken place in June, a simple but beautiful ceremony in the chapel of Dr. Hartwell's alma mater, Cambridge. Unlike the grand society spectacle that her marriage to Blackwood would have been, this celebration had been intimate and meaningful, attended only by those who truly cared for the couple's happiness. Agatha had wept openly during the ceremony. Charlotte had served as maid of honor with radiant joy, and even some of the women from their London schools had made the journey to witness their teacher's happiness. "Mrs. Hartwell," Alexander said softly, appearing behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "You're up early this morning." She leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural the title sounded, how perfectly it fit the woman she had become. "I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about today's opening ceremony." Today marked the official opening of the Bath Institute for Women's Education, their most ambitious project yet. What had begun as a small school in London's East End had grown into a comprehensive program, offering everything from basic literacy to advanced training in bookkeeping, nursing, and even teaching. The institute represented everything they had worked toward, a place where women could acquire the skills and confidence needed to support themselves with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. "Nervous?" Alexander asked, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Excited," she corrected, "and perhaps a little overwhelmed by how far we've come." The transformation in their lives had been remarkable. Dr. Hartwell's work had gained recognition throughout England, earning support from progressive members of Parliament and wealthy philanthropists who shared their vision of social reform. Evangeline's own reputation had evolved from that of a scandalous figure to a respected advocate for women's rights and education. Her book, Letters to Young Women on Independence and Self-Worth, had become surprisingly popular among educated women seeking to expand their horizons. "The carriages are arriving," Alexander observed, nodding toward the street where several elegant vehicles were depositing their passengers. Among the first to arrive was Agatha, magnificent as always in deep purple silk, accompanied by Charlotte, who had blossomed into a confident young woman with her own passionate interest in educational reform. Charlotte had chosen to remain unmarried, much to their parents' continued horror, and instead devoted herself to managing the administrative aspects of their various schools and programs. "Evangeline, darling," Charlotte called out as she swept into the house, her arms full of flowers for the ceremony. "The most wonderful news! The Duchess of Devonshire has agreed to serve as patron of our new program for governess training." "That's marvelous," Evangeline replied, embracing her sister warmly. The relationship between them had healed completely, strengthened by their shared commitment to helping other women avoid the traps that had once ensnared them both. "And," Agatha added with obvious satisfaction, "I've received word that 3 more cities have requested assistance in establishing similar institutes. Birmingham, Manchester, and Edinburgh are all interested in our model." The success of their work had exceeded even their most optimistic projections. What had begun as a small effort to help a few desperate women had grown into a movement that was quietly revolutionizing opportunities for women throughout England. They had proven that given proper education and support, women could contribute meaningfully to society in ways that extended far beyond traditional domestic roles. As the morning progressed, the house filled with guests arriving for the opening ceremony. Members of Parliament, local dignitaries, successful graduates of their London programmes, and curious members of Bath society mingled in the drawing room, creating an atmosphere of excitement and anticipation. "Mrs. Hartwell," a familiar voice said behind her, and Evangeline turned to see the Earl of Pembroke, who had become one of their most generous supporters. "I wanted to personally congratulate you on this achievement. The Institute represents exactly the kind of progressive thinking our society needs. Thank you, my lord. Your support has been invaluable in making this dream a reality. I understand you've had some rather interesting correspondence recently," he continued with a knowing smile. Evangeline's eyes sparkled with amusement. "If you're referring to the letter from Lord Pemberton requesting a reconciliation, then yes, it was quite illuminating." The letter from her father had arrived 3 weeks earlier, filled with awkward attempts at reconciliation and thinly veiled requests for financial assistance. The Pemberton estates had indeed fallen into bankruptcy, just as Agatha had predicted, and Lord Edmund found himself in the humiliating position of seeking help from the daughter he had disowned. "And your response?" the Earl inquired. "I offered to provide him with information about our programs for teaching practical skills to those who need to support themselves," Evangeline replied with quiet dignity. "I thought he might benefit from learning a trade." The Earl's laughter was rich with appreciation. "Perfectly handled, my dear. Charity without enabling, assistance with dignity and tact." As they made their way to the Institute for the opening ceremony, Evangeline reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. The building itself was a converted Georgian mansion, its elegant rooms now filled with desks, books, and the tools of various trades. The main hall buzzed with excitement as current students, graduates, supporters, and curious onlookers gathered for the dedication. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded room, "we gather today to celebrate not just the opening of a new institution, but the recognition of a fundamental truth that every human being, regardless of gender or circumstance, deserves the opportunity to develop their full potential." Applause filled the room as he continued, outlining their vision for the Institute and introducing the various programs they would offer. When he called Evangeline forward to speak, she felt a moment of the old nervousness, but it was quickly replaced by the confidence that had grown from months of public speaking and advocacy. "When I first began working in education," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I was a woman who had lost everything I thought defined my worth, my reputation, my family's approval, my predetermined future. What I discovered was that losing those things allowed me to find something far more valuable, my own sense of purpose, and the knowledge that my worth comes from within, not from others' opinions. She looked out at the faces before her, women who had faced their own struggles, men who supported their cause, young girls whose futures would be shaped by the opportunities they created here. The women who will study here come from all walks of life. Some are widows who must support their families, others are young women seeking alternatives to marriage as their only option for security. Some have faced scandal or disgrace, while others simply hunger for knowledge and independence. What unites them all is the desire to control their own destinies. The applause was thunderous, but Evangeline wasn't finished. We live in a time of great change, when old assumptions about women's capabilities are being challenged and proven false. The graduates of our programs are becoming teachers, nurses, bookkeepers, and business owners. They are proving that given the opportunity, women can contribute to society in ways that benefit everyone. As she concluded her remarks, Evangeline caught sight of a familiar figure at the back of the room. Her breath caught as she recognized Mrs. Mary Thompson, the seamstress who had been among her first students in London. Mary was now elegantly dressed and accompanied by a well-dressed gentleman and 2 children. After the ceremony, Mary approached with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell, I had to come to thank you personally. Because of what I learned in your classes, I was able to start my own dressmaking business. I now employ 6 other women, and," she gestured to the gentleman beside her, "I was able to marry for love rather than desperation." "Mary, I'm so proud of you," Evangeline said, embracing her former student warmly. "You did all the hard work. I simply provided the opportunity." "You provided hope," Mary replied firmly, "and sometimes that's the most valuable gift of all." Indeed, as the afternoon wore on, Evangeline found herself surrounded by similar stories of transformation and success. Women who had once been desperate and dependent had become confident and self-sufficient. The ripple effects of their work extended far beyond the individuals they had directly helped, touching families and communities throughout England. "Quite a day," Alexander said, as they finally returned home in the early evening, exhausted but exhilarated by the success of the opening. "Quite a life," Evangeline corrected, settling beside him on the sofa in their cozy sitting room. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how different everything is from what I once thought it would be." "Do you ever regret the path not taken?" he asked gently. "The life of luxury and social prominence you might have had?" Evangeline considered the question seriously. She thought of the grand estates, the elaborate gowns, the endless round of social obligations that would have defined her existence as Lady Blackwood. Then she thought of the meaningful work that now filled her days, the love and respect she shared with Alexander, the knowledge that her life had purpose beyond mere ornamentation. "Never," she said firmly, "that life would have been a beautiful prison. This life is freedom." Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her arms full of correspondence. "I hate to interrupt your romantic moment," she said with a grin, "but we've received some rather interesting letters today." "More requests for new institutes?" Alexander asked. "Better than that," Charlotte replied, settling into a chair with obvious excitement. "We've received an invitation to address Parliament about women's education, a request from the University of Edinburgh to establish a women's college, and," she paused dramatically, "a letter from the Queen herself expressing interest in our work." Evangeline stared at her sister in amazement. "The Queen? Apparently, Her Majesty has been following our progress with great interest. She's particularly impressed by our success in helping women become self-sufficient rather than dependent on charity." The implications were staggering. Royal support would legitimize their work in ways they had never dared to hope for, opening doors that had previously been firmly closed to women's advancement. "There's more," Charlotte continued, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "We've also received a rather pathetic letter from Lord Blackwood, requesting a loan to cover his gambling debts. It seems his marriage to the wealthy American heiress he pursued after our scandal fell through when her father discovered his true character. And your response? Evangeline asked, though she suspected she already knew. I suggested he might benefit from our new program teaching practical skills to those who need to support themselves, Charlotte replied with satisfaction. I thought he might have a talent for manual labor. Their laughter filled the room, but it wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was the laughter of women who had found their own strength and no longer needed to define themselves in opposition to those who had wronged them. As the evening settled around them, Evangeline reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation that had once seemed like the end of everything had instead become the beginning of a life more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. She had learned that true worth came not from others' approval, but from one's own actions and choices. What are you thinking about? Alexander asked softly, noting her contemplative expression. I'm thinking, she said, taking his hand in hers, about all the women who will pass through these doors in the years to come. Each one will have her own story, her own struggles, her own dreams. And we'll be here to help them discover that they have the power to write their own endings. Outside their window, the lights of Bath twinkled like stars, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility. Somewhere in the city, women were dreaming of better futures, of independence and purpose, and the freedom to choose their own paths. Tomorrow, some of them would walk through the doors of the Institute, ready to begin the journey towards self-discovery and empowerment. And Evangeline would be there to welcome them, to share the most important lesson she had learned, that sometimes the greatest gift life can give us is the opportunity to start over, to bloom where we're planted, and to discover that our true worth was always within us, waiting to be recognized and nurtured. The girl who had once been sold like property was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned to value herself and to help others do the same. And in that transformation lay the greatest victory of all, the triumph of the human spirit over circumstance, of love over fear, and of hope over despair. As she settled into Alexander's embrace, surrounded by the warmth of their home and the satisfaction of meaningful work, Evangeline knew that she had found something far more precious than the golden cage of her youth. She had found freedom, purpose, and the knowledge that true happiness came not from what others could give her, but from what she could give to the world. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and rich with promise. And whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the confidence of a woman who had learned to trust in her own strength and the power of love to transform even the most desperate circumstances into something beautiful and meaningful. In the end, that was the greatest lesson of all, that we are not victims of our circumstances, but architects of our own destinies, capable of creating lives of purpose and joy, regardless of where we begin. And that truth, once discovered, could never be taken away. If this story of transformation and triumph has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage and resilience. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a moment that seemed like the end but became a new beginning? Your story might inspire someone else to find their own strength. Don't forget to like this video and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of hope and human triumph.